Okay, so this is sections part 6, all about wages. So we jump in chapter 19 here. The transformation of value of labor power into wages. So he first starts out by throwing shade at Ricardo, like you do. So he starts by saying, "What is the value of a commodity?" So basically indicating, like, okay, yeah, because their labor can be bought and sold on the market, it ought to function like a commodity. So he says the objective form of the social labor expended in production would be the value of the commodity. Okay, great. We already know that. He says, okay, well, how do we measure the quantity of that value? And obviously it's the quantity of labor contained in it. Um, or I guess that's not obvious. I think this is where he's leading into Ricardo's argument. But anyways, how then is the value of a 12-hour working day determined? And he says, well, obviously, if we're following this train of thought, then the 12 hours contained in a 12-hour working day is the value of a 12-hour working day, which is an absurd tautology. And then actually, I kind of like the footnote here as well, where he says Mr. Ricardo, ingeniously enough, avoids a difficulty which, on a first view, threatens to encumber his doctrine that value depends on the quantity of labor employed in its production. Um, so, I mean, I guess that's the first thing I'll point out, right? Is it like, notice the distinction between Ricardo's way of you know, his language, the way he words it, which is the quantity of labor contained in a thing, versus how Marx would define value, right? Socially necessary labor time. Those are There are different, but he'll continue why this is absurd. He says, if this principle is rigidly adhered to, it follows that the value of the labor depends on the quantity of labor employed in producing it, which is evidently absurd. And by a dexterous turn, therefore, Mr. Ricardo makes the value of labor depend on the quantity of labor required to produce wages. Or to give him the benefit of his own language, he maintains that the value of labor is to be estimated by the quantity of labor required to produce wages, by which he means the quantity of labor required to produce the money or commodities given to the labor. This is similar to saying that the value of cloth is estimated not by the quantity of labor bestowed on its production, but by the quantity of labor bestowed on the production of the silver for which the cloth is exchanged. So yeah, that's kind of why he's calling it a tautology, which if you're not familiar with that means. It's like an identity. It's like saying one equals one, right? Because you're saying, oh well, the value of 12 working hours is 12 working hours, because that's what you get paid for it. And if you're getting paid for 12 working hours, then you must have been paid with 12 working hours worth of stuff. But he's like, well, if you just keep using 12 working hours as your measuring stick over and over again, that's not really, we're not getting anywhere. Um, so this is a little bit of backstory, I guess you could say, on why Marx comes up with this distinction, which I have summarized this old PowerPoint. Um, so the distinction between labor and labor power is what is kind of Marx's solution to this tautology, or how to get around it. It's not even get around it. It's more like just a correction, I guess you could say, to what Ricardo had before him. So here's the distinction. So labor, or when he says, like, the quantity of labor, for example, what he's talking about is sort of the actual act of working. And this is also where this quote kind of fits nicely, right? So as soon as his labor, so soon as his labor really begins, it ceases to belong to him and therefore can no longer be sold by him. So labor kind of happens after you've already sold your time, if you will, to the capitalists. And then the other aspect, of course, is the products of labor are appropriated by capitalists. Okay. What Marx introduces is the idea of labor power, the capacity or ability to do work. So, right, this is where basically a laborer is not selling, um, they're not selling their literal labor, not necessarily. They're selling uh, their ability to do work for a certain amount of time. And this is the other important aspect, right? Is that you always sell your labor in units of time, some unit for some period, basically. And then this other quote, right? His labor power has grown up with this person and is inseparable from them. So can't take labor power away from somebody. It's sort of inherently just something humans can do. Although not everybody has the same labor powers, right? Like I would be a terrible NBA player, for example, right? It's not a labor power I can sell at the market, so to speak. But like, you know, you could flip it around and say like, oh well, my profession requires like a certain degree of training and education, and so if you don't have that, you wouldn't be trained to sort of adequately do the same labor that I get paid to do, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not to say that everyone has like identical um, labor powers or like the capacity to do a very specific kind of work. Um, and certainly some people can do the work for maybe longer periods of time than others, so on and so forth. So obviously variations between people, but everyone has at least some sort of labor power. Every proletarian, I guess, every worker that works for a capitalist is selling their labor power to the capitalist. What that labor power is, like what the contract is for, exactly, obviously will vary on the job and what you're being hired to do. But you are primarily selling your ability to do the job for a certain amount of time. That's kind of the key distinction here. So yeah, let's slightly not too much else. Let's see. I think I may have gone over this last time, but I want to skip forward a little bit here. Oh, and I guess in the actual chapter, this paragraph is really where he kind of answers the age old this question of like, how do you get around this contradiction? So he's again dragging the political economists, um, suggesting basically they're doing circular reasoning and all that. So he says what they called the value of labor is in fact the value of labor power as it exists in the personality of the worker, and it is different from its function, labor, as a machine is from the operations it performs. So, right, think about this comparison to a worker and a machine. If you were to buy a machine that will eventually like assist in your production process somehow, you are just buying. This, by the way, this would also work for leasing if you do a lease. A lease might even be, ironically, like more analogous to a wage in some funny way, because it is for a definite period of time. Right? You're sort of getting loaned the machine for, I don't know, let's say a year, and you you pay for that machine on, I don't know, a monthly basis, whatever, for the ability to use it. Right? So you could lease a machine for a year, pay monthly, and just never use the machine if you want. That would obviously not be a great idea because now the machine is just sitting there costing you money doing nothing. So in order to kind of make your money back, so to speak, you want that machine to assist in the making of commodities. Hopefully you would hire a laborer to come use it, But when it comes to hiring the labor, it's pretty similar. You could theoretically hire somebody, pay them monthly. Let's say you hire them for a year, like a year-long contract or something. You pay them monthly for the whole year. That's their wage. And they could theoretically do nothing. They could just do no labor, but they'd still be getting a wage. That's because you hired them for their ability to labor for a certain amount of time. What comes on the other end of that is what's important for the capitalist, right? They're concerned that in that period where they've paid you, they want to squeeze as much out of you as possible. Maybe another, I guess another example, if you want, is if for some reason you were to lease an orange, like the fruit, okay? Just bear with me for a second. You could, so let's say you pay monthly for an orange to have that orange for a whole year for whatever reason. Now, if you want to recoup your money, you're probably going to want to squeeze all the juice out of that orange as you possibly can to make orange juice and then sell the orange juice, make your money back. But you could also just let the orange sit there doing nothing. So you bought that orange, if you will, as a means of production for its ability to produce juice, not because it is juice itself. That's kind of the distinction that we're talking about here. So the analogy to buying a machine because it's able to function versus buying the actual output of the machine. Obviously, you're not buying the output of a machine because you're not, if you're a capitalist at least, you're not interested in buying final products. You're interested in making final products and then selling them. There's a distinction. That's the distinction here. So I guess just to continue this, right? Because so they being the political economists, because they were concerned with the difference between the market price of labor and its so-called value, with the relation of this value to the rate of profit and to the values of the commodities produced by the means of labor, etc. They never discovered that the course of the analysis had led not only from the market prices of labor to its presumed value, but also to the resolution of this value of labor itself, to the value of labor power. Okay. So he's basically saying, yeah, they all got confused because they got their terms mixed up here with like value of labor, natural price, that good stuff. That's why he says it led into inextricable confusions and contradictions, etc. So that is his. Oh, okay. So yeah, I did cover this paragraph last time, but I kind of want to go over it again because it's a very, very good paragraph. I think arguably, if you need like a super succinct way of describing to somebody the differences between slavery, feudalism, and capitalism as economic systems, despite all being class systems, economic systems sort of defined by some sort of class structure. I think this paragraph does a phenomenal job at helping us understand like kind of the appearance versus reality of the different social relations that define the relations of production within these modes of production. So let's just walk through it, right? Okay, so don't worry about the shillings math too much, but he says, okay, 6 hours of labor is the paid portion of a working day. So that appears as the value or price of the whole working day of 12 hours, which thus includes 6 hours which have not been paid for. The wage form, this is like the capitalist wage labor, thus extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, to paid labor and unpaid labor. All the labor appears as paid labor. So this first part basically is describing the capitalist mode of production, and more specifically the relation of production that is capital, capital and wage labor, right? When you get paid at the end of the day or end of the week, whatever, end of the month, it appears as if 100% of your labor has been paid for, because that's what the contract says, right? And yet, as Marx has already demonstrated in the earlier chapters, we know that, now he's just using a 50-50 split here, so we'll just stick with that. We'll just say, yeah, well, half of your time was actually paid for and half of it actually wasn't, even though it looks like it was all paid for. So let's continue into, this is the corvée system, which I think is, I don't know where corvée comes from. Maybe it's French or something, but I know it's basically referring to like a feudal arrangement, where like the serf and the lord sort of agree on like, you know, hey serf, like I need whatever 8/10 of your crop this season or something like that, but you can keep the other 20% for yourself or something like that. Anyways, he says under the corvée system it is different. There, the labor of the serf is for himself, and his compulsory labor for the lord, the lord of the land, or the landlord, are demarcated very clearly, both in space and time. So, ironically, in the feudal arrangement, basically, where you have serfs and lords, they have almost a very explicit agreement, but about how much of the serf's labor belongs to the lord versus themselves. Most of the time, these sort of, it's not really an agreement, right? Because mostly it's the lord just saying, like, this is how it is, basically. You live on my land, and I make the rules. Right, it's pretty much, I make the rules here, and because you live on my land, you essentially have no choice. That's also kind of the entire idea behind rent, right? Rent is basically like, you know, the landlord, the lord in this example, gets a chunk. Yeah, they just have the right to claim a chunk of your income just because you live on land that they say is theirs. Yeah, it's pretty explicit. Yeah, and if any of you care to do this, maybe if you keep a personal budget spreadsheet or something, you could probably figure this out very easily. You can just do the math, right? Whatever your monthly income is, you can just look at your rent, for example, and just determine what percentage of your income goes straight to rent. In other words, it goes straight to somebody who is just doing almost nothing essentially to, other than just they have a deed to the land, essentially a deed to the building, whatever, but they basically, realistically you were probably coerced into renting because you probably couldn't afford property of your own, and so now you have in ink, written somewhere on a lease, you can, yes, it's obviously measured in dollar amounts, but you can also think of it as, I agree to give, let's call it 15% of my income to this person because I live on their land. That's it. I mean, that is pretty much what the corvée system, that's what Marx is describing. And so, like, it's very blatant. It's not very well disguised, and it's also very obvious that, like, this transaction is so overwhelmingly beneficial to one person and not the other, that there's no reason for it to exist. Hint, hint, wink, wink. But anyways, that's sort of what Marx is saying here, right? That when you sign that lease to pay rent, for example, it is super clear what's happening. You are getting screwed, and you know it, and you know it. There's no illusory curtain. It's just nope. I take your money. You live on my land. That's pretty much it. Okay. Now he says in slave labor, even the part of the working day in which the slave is only replacing the value of his own means of subsistence, in which he therefore actually works for himself, appears as labor for his master. All his labor appears as unpaid labor. In wage labor, on the contrary, even the surplus labor or unpaid labor appears to be paid. So in the one case, the property relation conceals the slave's labor for himself. In the other case, the money relation conceals the uncompensated labor for the wage labor. Yeah. And this is sort of, I jump back to this meme I made long ago. Funny enough, actually, from the very first book club meeting. This one. But this meme of, well, that just sounds like slavery with extra steps. It's more like, well, yeah. You could also just say, well, that just sounds like slavery with a slightly different, what's it called, social relation. They would both be basically correct, right? And I guess because we're on the topic, this idea of like why are we selling our labor power to capitalists? Marx gives a pretty easy answer. Hopefully, it's not shocking to anyone. But why do we sell our labor? Is in order to live. Our life activity, labor, therefore, is but a means of securing our own existence. But the worker, whose only source of income is the sale of his labor power, cannot leave the whole class of buyers, i.e., the capitalist class, unless he gives up his own existence. He does not belong to this or that capitalist, but to the capitalist class as a whole. So, this idea of, capitalism and slavery, not totally different, but what capital does arguably better than slavery, in terms of, from the perspective of the property classes, is it disguises the relation much better. Indeed, Marx is basically saying here that like even in a slavery system, you still need to like feed, house, water, clothe your slaves to keep them alive. If you are the slave master, like you're gonna have to use some of your revenue to just pay enough subsistence to for subsistence, keep your slaves alive so they can continue working and so forth. Now, this is clearly not a wage because there's no real choice in the matter. So it's what Marx is saying is that you still have that your working day is still some percentage, quote, like necessary labor that is quote unquote paid. Now, again, technically in the slavery system, like no one's getting money for that. They're getting just straight up means of subsistence. There's no market exchange happening. That's obviously a big difference too. But from the slave's perspective, you obviously are not getting paid for at all. You never receive any money. So it appears like all of your labor is unpaid, when in actual fact, whatever revenue your labor produced for the owner, some of that has to come back into just feeding yourself or feeding the slave. So Marx is saying it's kind of like working for yourself for at least a little bit of the day, while the rest of the day is just purely for whoever the owner is. Now, in capitalism, it's pretty much 100% inverted, even though the class dynamic and this idea of like part of your labor is unpaid and part of it's paid, that part of it is mostly the same. That part did not really change that much. The big difference is that the workers sort of think they're being paid for all of their labor when that's not really the case. So I'll just kind of continue after that one with this next paragraph because it's also pretty good. He says, "We may therefore understand the decisive importance of the transformation of the value and price of labor power into the form of wages or into the value and price of labor itself. All the notions of justice held by both the worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all capitalism's illusions about freedom, all the apologetic tricks of vulgar economics, have as their basis the form of appearance discussed above, which makes the actual relation visible, and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite of that relation." So again, this is what Marx is all about, right? In his analysis, is not only do appearances not match the reality, they're usually the complete opposite. Or not, I mean, not usually, but in this case, it is the complete opposite. Right? You think you're being paid for all of your labor when in fact you're being paid for as little of your labor as they can get away with. Right? Capitalists are constantly trying to push the minimum, like push your wage closer and closer to the minimum, aka like subsistence wage. That is their economic driver. Which, again, if you're just being paid a subsistence wage, I think Marx would ask, what is the difference between that and slavery, other than appearances? Right? That's pretty much his conclusion there. Okay, so I think that's probably good for 19. Jump to 20. So just to get introduced really quick, so we're going to talk about this chapter and the next, talk about time wages and peace wages. So he says, wages take many forms. This fact is not apparent from the ordinary economic treaties, which, in their crude obsession with the material side, ignore all differences of form. An exposition of the form belongs to the special study of a wage labor and not therefore to this work. But he's going to give, description of the two forms here. So the sale of labor power, as will be remembered, always takes place for definite periods of time. The converted form, in which the daily value, weekly value, etc. of labor power is directly presented here, is hence that of time wages or day wages, etc. So this is pretty much, if you're selling your ability to labor for a certain amount of time, it makes sense that the rate you get paid at is measured, by the day or by the week or whatever, like per a unit time. So he just wants to make some points about this, I suppose. A lot of unnecessarily weird fractions later. We have a decent summary here. So he says, as a general law, it follows that given the amount of daily, weekly labor, etc., the daily or weekly wage depends on the price of labor, which itself varies either with the value of labor power or with the divergencies between its price and its value. Given the price of labor, on the other hand, the daily or weekly wage depends on the quantity of labor expended, daily or weekly. The unit of measurement for time wages, or the price of the working hour, is the value of a day's labor divided by the number of hours in the average working day. So that's kind of our basic definition for a time wage, right? So it's whatever the value of a day's labor power divided by the number of hours you're working. Okay. Yeah. So I guess the example here says, okay, if the working day is 12 hours and the value of labor power for a whole day is 3 shillings, um, then the price of a working hour is 3 pence. Okay, great. Uh, and then he's okay. I'll skip a little bit. Skip some of the weird math, weird English coinage units. As on our hypothesis, he must work on an average of 6 hours a day in order to produce a day's wage, which corresponds to nothing more than the value of his labor power. And as on the hypothesis he works only half an hour for himself and half for the capitalist, it is clear that he cannot attain for himself the value product of 6 hours if he is employed for less than 12 hours. In previous chapters, we saw the destructive consequences of overwork, but here we come upon the origin of the sufferings, which arise for the worker out of his being insufficiently employed. So this is kind of interesting, right? So he talks about how the capitalist can now wring from the worker a certain quantity of surplus labor without allowing him the labor time necessary for his own subsistence. He can annihilate all regularity of employment according to his own convenience, caprice, and interest of the moment, make the most frightful overwork alternate with relative or absolute cessation of work. So, right, if you basically get laid off, um, or you can basically like this is I think maybe the idea of like a um, capital strike. I think. I mean, correct me if anyone is thinking of this differently, but yeah, the ability to basically halt work from the capitalist perspective might seem sort of detrimental to them to their whole operation. Um, but they can also use it as a cudgel against their workers because if the workers don't, if they're not working for any amount of time, they're not getting any wages. Right? It's sort of a way of, like I said, it's like a cudgel. It's a way of like disciplining your workforce. Well, right. It's basically like, oh, you're unhappy with, you know, maybe the length of the working day being too long. Well, it could be 0. And if it's 0, you don't get a wage at all. So it's sort of like, oh, shit. Well, you know, if I'm threatened between working like insanely long hours or not working at all, imagine this is like a small company town where there's like literally one place of employment and a bunch of workers who don't really have the basically there's like the one monopoly on the buying of labor power, if you want to think of it that way. That's obviously bad for the workers because they could potentially be threatened by a capital strike, which is essentially the inverse of a labor strike. So a labor strike is where the laborers basically say, "Hey, fuck you, we're not going to work for you," and kind of slowly starve your business of profit, basically of surplus value, by refusing to work, and in the hopes that the capitalists will come to the bargaining table and basically agree to higher wages. It, now, capital from the other way around, capital could potentially use that to their advantage as well, by just not letting the workers work at all and basically refusing to pay them a wage until they submit to worse working conditions because they're desperate for a wage. Obviously, that is highly contextual. It'll just depend on a lot of circumstances if that will work. It's certainly a pretty big gamble for the capitalist, but it does remain as sort of an option they have. Uh, yeah. Okay. Moving on. Yeah, I guess it's true. Like I don't capital freezes like don't happen that much anymore because I think it is easier. Right. Yeah, it's I know Marx talked about it earlier in the text about basically Marx doesn't use the term layoffs, but he basically does, right? About like capital constantly has a drive to basically shrink the workforce as much as possible and at the same time squeeze more and more labor out of each individual labor as possible. So increasing the intensity. So I mean that sort of drive is also pretty clearly visible in layoffs, for example. But yeah, you can also use it as basically just like like I said, a cudgel, where you're just like, oh, this I don't know, this sector of the company is getting uppity, and like you said, has all these demands. We'll just lay them all off and contract it out. F it. Oh, for sure. Right. And even if it isn't necessarily lower wages, it can be on the other end where it's like insanely competitive positions where they're gonna work you to death because oh hey, there's like 10 other people that want this job, and if you want to keep it, you better work your ass off, or we'll just fire you and get a new one. It's Amazon's scheme. I mean, it's like a very well known, very predatory practice in like Hollywood. I know it's very well known where it's like this idea of, especially in like, well, I mean, I'm sure almost every job in Hollywood, but it's sort of like, hey, this is a very lucrative industry. If you want to be this next big name actor, like there's 35 other people out that door who want the same job. So like you just got to work totally shitty working conditions, shitty wages, whatever, uh, because the position is so highly coveted. I mean, I think that goes for a lot of industries, especially um, tech. Yeah, I was gonna say tech. I mean, shit, like academia. I feel like is like that too. Um, yeah, I'm sure. Probably medicine too. I'd imagine. Like, it sounds like doctors work. Yeah, it sounds like doctors work like pretty outrageous hours sometimes. Yeah, that's kind of the common theme between all of those professions, isn't it? It's like, oh, don't you like doing this? Don't you? Isn't it fulfilling enough that you can just not get paid? It's like, no. It is, and I guess along the same lines that we're just talking about, right? Um, it's a generally known fact that the longer the working day in a branch of industry, the lower the wages are. Um, ironically, um, seemingly ass backwards. um, it is bullshit, but at the same time, uh, so this is sort of, well, okay. Let me get through these short paragraph. It'll illuminate what's going on here. Okay, so first of all, he'll say, okay, yeah, this Redgrave guy kind of observed this. So he observed that wages rose under the 10 Hours Act, while they fell in factories where they went from 14 to 15 hours every day. So basically, this was observed by factory inspectors from the law stated above, namely that the price of labor being given the daily or weekly wage depends on the quantity of labor expended. It follows, first of all, the lower the price of labor, the greater must be the quantity of labor, or the longer is the working day. For the worker to secure even a miserable average wage, the low level of price of labor here acts as a stimulus to the extension of labor time. So it kind of just makes sense that if your wage is like ridiculously low rate, you're going to have to work for longer to make a living. It's a pretty simple formula, but yeah. Yeah, that's a very good contemporary example because I think there are still, I think nowadays, different, slightly different than when Marx is writing, there are significantly more overtime laws, and capitalists want to typically avoid overtime. Um, so yeah, they will cap your working day at like hours, for example. But if you're only making $10 an hour and you got like a family to feed, you're right. They might go work another 8 hour shift at a different job, like a night shift. Then they're actually making ends meet, but their whole working day, even though it was split between two capitalists, for example, was just like a 16-hour day. So when we read this, read Capital, and we're thinking, oh my gosh, imagine working 14 or 15-hour days. That's crazy. It's like people still do that all the time. It's just they just jump around the legality of it all by working two jobs for 7 hours or two jobs for 8 hours. Yeah. Yep. Or God forbid you use your spare time to do, community service or something where you actually like you're still working, you're just not working for a wage, you're actually working to help people in real material ways. Shocker. Yeah. That's how that's how I typically explain it to that's how I sometimes will explain it. I'm like, yeah, even if I have like a week of work where I don't do a whole lot of actual worky work, um, for whatever reason, I will almost always fill that time with like other work that's just I don't get paid for. Basically, it's like hobbies, shit. Sometimes, like hell, today, like I was telling you guys earlier, like I was rendering the freaking edited book club videos like all day. Now, I mean, that's not like super hands on. You mostly just set it up, put all the do a couple quick edits, and then you just render it for like 2 hours. But it's like, hey, I had this like side thing I'm doing while I'm doing my other work. So it's like, yeah, I'm still working. I'm just spending the time I would, in a way, I choose to, versus how I am forced to, basically. Yes. Do you have zero creative outlets? Because most creative endeavors involve like some kind of labor, even if it's all mental. Hey, painting counts. And I mean, shit. There's people who do that for an actual job, right? Like that's their actual thing. Yeah. I guess they just have to be cracked at it. Though. Gotta be like really good stuff. Well, that shows how much I know about it because I wouldn't be able to tell. Yep. I've also seen those videos of like what appear to be almost like sweatshops of people painting minis. So like, there's definitely a little bit of a dark side to that too. All right. So to wrap this paragraph here, so he's, I guess, what he's referring to in this paragraph here is this idea of some bakers like underselling their bread, um, which pissed everyone off. Okay, whatever. But we're still talking about basically this idea between the appearance versus the reality, and the reality meaning like the real social relations. Okay, so kind of coming back to this idea, this Jeremiad is also interesting because it shows how it is only the semblance of the relations of production which is reflected on the brain of the capitalist. He does not know that the normal price of labor also includes a definite quantity of unpaid labor, and that this very unpaid labor is the source of his profits. So this is an interesting thing Marx is saying, because he's indicating that like even capitalists may not be fully aware of their own their own system that they benefit from, which is kind of funny to think about. But it also kind of goes back to that idea, right, of like the capitalists are also basically cogs in the machine, are just as replaceable. They're not necessarily they're not really needed, uh, or like individual capitalists aren't really needed. Just someone to be a capitalist is um, but they don't even need to know what's happening. They just need to be there, like just grease the wheels. Yeah, exactly. Like, they don't really need to know what's going on either. Like they just kind of have to do the absolute bare minimum, um, which is just make people work as much as possible. Um, he says the category of surplus labor time does not exist at all for him, since it is included in the normal working day, which he thinks he is paid for in the day's wages. But overtime, namely the prolongation of the working day beyond its limits corresponding to the usual price of labor, certainly does exist for him. When faced with his underselling competitor, he even insists upon extra pay for this overtime. Again, he does not know that this extra pay also includes unpaid labor just as much as the price of the customary hour of labor does. Um, so he's kind of talking about this side. We actually already brought up overtime, but Marx is addressing overtime here. And he's again, this is funny because Marx is basically saying that, like, yeah, the capitalists sort of like recoil at overtime. They don't like overtime, just like we were saying earlier. Like they don't like it that much because to them it's like, well, I'm I'm paying a worker even more, like an even higher wage, um, despite getting more work out of them, and it's like, this is not as good of a deal. Um, but Marx again, stupid shillings and pence math. He shows that basically, um, that pre overtime you get half of your working hour appropriated from the worker, and in the overtime case you get one third. Um, you get one third of an hour, free labor basically. So Marx is like, yeah, I mean, if you're a capitalist, paying overtime may not be ideal, but you're still appropriating unpaid labor. So like, don't sweat it. Like, he's like, they kind of recoil at the appearance. The appearance is like, a higher wage, but he's like, the social relation means they're still producing a surplus for you, so it's ultimately still bad for the worker. It's just not as bad. But they're also working overtime, which means they're probably like working themselves to death. And I think I may have scrolled past it, but I don't know exactly where it is. But Marx even says in the overtime section, like, he's like, let's be honest, if you're working overtime, yeah, you might get paid a little bit more, but chances are, yeah, your chances are you're gonna, like, you're burning yourself out, like physically, mentally, just you're ruining your body, like you're ruining yourself in an extremely unhealthy way. So the way Marx puts it is a little more mechanical, where he's like, oh, they need like extra sustenance, so like the extra wages just go to buying more food. And I think we all understand that, like, okay, yeah, maybe you need more calories literally to like function. But just like we were talking about the whole like grind set thing, it's like, in reality, if you're actually working 12 to like 16-hour days or whatever, like I will just say odds are very, very high that you are probably not very healthy in a lot of different ways. Like whether it be physically, mentally, both, whatever. Like you're probably not doing so hot. And just being paid more probably isn't enough to make up for that. Because yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us would disagree necessarily. The people who do actually end up working those types of hours like consistently are ridiculously burnt out, like very quickly, and are not they're not the happiest. Yeah, even the that's why I almost like I don't even really believe like the whole grind set like, oh, there's actually people out there who are like, yeah dude, I work like crazy hours, it's sick, I love it. It's like, first of all, you probably don't even work at crazy hours, first of all, and I'm assuming a lot of that quote unquote work is just like, I don't know, gambling on stocks or something. So you're not working. Hmm. Oh, because they get paid by the mile. Yeah, that is an interesting one. Actually, that's actually a very good transition to this chapter. Piece wages, because I would, if I think about it for a second, if you are a trucker and you get paid by the mile, I think that counts as a piece wage, right? Right. It's a direct measurement of your output, and it's like for a trucker, your output is moving stuff. So if they're saying they're literally measuring how far you have moved things, and that's what you get paid on, then they have a piece wage. So yeah, let's go through this really quick. I'm sure it won't be that quick, but you know what I mean. But yeah, that's basic definition of a piece wage. Um, I mean, interestingly, Marx is saying it's nothing but a converted form of time wage. Technically, that's true because whatever the output is will take a definite amount of time. That's all right, but it's a little bit different, right? So, um, at least when you're working a time wage, if you're based, you can just work less and effectively get paid to do less work. In that, like, basically, your wage is not directly tied to your labor intensity, right? So if I'm basically guaranteed um, a wage for the week for a 40-hour work week, then as long as I show up and kind of do like at least the bare minimum for 40 hours, then I can still get paid. Right? Because that's sort of the idea from the worker's perspective. If you have a time wage and you're based, you should probably be doing the bare minimum. That, and also, even if it's not part of the contract, just do as little as you can, still get away with it. Yeah. Yeah, commission is interesting because I think commission is definitely would be categorized under piece wage. Um, but yeah, like, I don't know much about those contracts where it's like sales commissions, especially where it's sort of like you get a percentage of the sale or something. So you're sort of constantly incentivized to like upsell and blah blah blah. The irony is if you're constantly trying to upsell people, you might just like turn them off completely and they buy nothing and you're just like, oh fuck. But like I said, I've never had a job like that, so I'm not sure what that is like specifically. Sure, it sucks. So I think now I know get to oh no, it's fine. Yeah, since let's see. All right, so Mark says here, since the quality and intensity of the work are here controlled by the very form of the wage, superintendence of labor becomes to a great extent superfluous. Piece wages, therefore, form the basis for the modern domestic labor we described earlier, as well as for a hierarchically organized system of exploitation and oppression. The latter has two fundamental forms. On the one hand, piece wages make it easier for parasites to interpose themselves between the capitalist and the wage labor, thus giving rise to the subletting of labor. Um, let's see, where have we seen this before? I'm trying to think of an example, like a modern example. I mean, I guess you kind of have like the idea of what's it called? Is dropship? Yeah, I guess subcontracting. It's like if you get paid. I guess I don't know. There are examples I think of like people get paid to be like computer programmers, for example. And obviously, if their output is like, hey, I need like I don't know an app developed in like 6 months, they might just take part of their wage and hire someone like hire some random other worker um you know, possibly in a developing country who's like a way better developer than they are, and they can just pay them like a shitty wage and be like, hey, I need an app in like a few months, like snap to it. It's I don't know what Fiverr is. Okay. Okay, got it. Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much what I'm thinking of then too, because that's what I think of this, right? Is it's like workers hiring other workers basically to do their work for them, just at a even worse rate. um, I'm sure there's plenty of like highly exploitative examples in the modern day. Um, like I mean, I even because there's also the other version I was trying to think of is like drop shipping. Maybe I think that's a little bit different because that's a little bit more like old school. Um, buy cheap, sell high, right? Because it's yeah, that's what I was getting a little confused from my head for a second. So I'm like, well, that's not really the same thing. Um, but anyways, yeah. So keep it going here. The profits of the middlemen come entirely from the difference between the price of labor and that the capitalist pays and the part of that price they actually allow the worker to receive. And in England, they call it the sweating system. Um, I don't know if this is where like sweatshop comes from, but I think that's kind of the idea, at least. So yeah. And then jumping ahead just a little bit here. Given the system of the piece wage, it is naturally in the personal interest of the worker that he should strain his labor power as intensely as possible. This in turn enables the capitalist to raise the normal degree of intensity of labor more easily. Moreover, the lengthening of the working day is now in the personal interest of the worker, since it is his daily or weekly wages. With it, his daily or weekly wages rise. This gradually brings on a reaction like that already described in time wages, quite apart from the fact the prolongation of the working day, even if the piece wage remains constant, includes a necessity in the fall in the price of labor. So yeah, piece wages, no bueno. Uh, and in fact, I think it's right here. Yeah, I kind of skipped the end of this paragraph, but it's yeah, you can highlight that too if you want. Uh, yeah, now the last part in the section to highlight, I think, more or less, from what has been shown so far, it is apparent that the piece wage is the form of wage most appropriate to the capitalist mode of production. Although by no means new, it figures officially side by side with time wages in French and English labor statutes, blah, blah, blah. It only conquered a larger field of action during the period of manufacture, properly so called. So, interesting observation from Marx is that he's suggesting that the piece wage, in fact, is actually the most efficient wage from the perspective of the capitalist, basically, or says most appropriate. Um, and this, I think, this kind of comes back to our idea that we've been talking about for a while now of like the intensity of labor being almost universally sought after by every capitalist. Like they always want you to be working not just longer, but harder while you're working. Like constantly on task, being as productive as possible. And if you're, and then the piece wage scenario, your wage pretty much is tied to your productivity. Um, that's basically another way of thinking of it. And yeah, he basically is like, in that scenario, if the workers want to be paid more, basically, then they unfortunately have to sort of lean in to what benefits the capitalists the most. So, while maybe the best for the capitalists, it is probably the worst for the workers, as you might expect. Yeah, I don't know exactly at what level um, like standardized curricula are determined, but it's probably like it's probably state level, the U.S. at least. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's what I was just about to say. Like, I'm sure there has to be some variation between states, but there are state legislatures like currently as we speak who are trying to be like, just like redact like so much US history from the actual books. Yeah, Florida. Right. That's right. They took all that money and went out west where they couldn't even use it. So, all right. Last section here, pretty short. Again, Mark's kind of basically saying like he'll comment on this, but it's not the main point of the whole text. Although I think he does come back to like international stuff later in some of the like later chapters. So for now, he'll say in comparing wages in different nations, we must therefore take into account all the factors that determine changes in the amount, the value of labor power, i.e., the price and the extent of the prime necessities of life, and in their natural and historical development, the cost of training the workers, the part played by the labor of women and children, the productivity of labor, its extensive and intensive magnitude, etc., aka material conditions. In every country, there's a certain average intensity of labor below which the labor for the production of a commodity requires more than the time socially necessary and therefore does not count as labor of normal quality. In a given country, only a degree of intensity which is above the national average alters the measurement of value by the mere duration of labor time. It is otherwise in the world market, whose integral parts are the individual countries. The average intensity of labor changes from country to country. Here's somewhere greater, somewhere is less. These national averages. Former scale as unit of measurement is the average unit of universal labor. The more intense the national labor, therefore, as compared with the less intense, produces in the same time more value, which just expresses itself in more money. So, in other words, like pretty straightforward, I guess, idea. The countries who exploit their laborers the most ruthlessly are more likely to have like the most money on the world market, basically. There's some assumptions baked into that, obviously. That's assuming a world market where everyone's like a quote unquote global free market, um, which is clearly not the case because you've got all kinds of like trade deals and sanctions, blah blah blah. So it's a little bit of a slight oversimplification. Yeah, Marx is oversimplifying a little bit, or more like if the world market actually worked this way, then we would expect this outcome, meaning we would expect the countries who exploit their laborers the most aggressively would be the most wealthy. Um, yeah, and I think that's the other thing about the other thing it's assumed, and I guess he actually does talk about this slightly here. Um, so we're kind of assuming uh, a capitalist global market here, where you know most countries are capitalists to some degree or another, and that's this paragraph is talking about like variations of development, right? Um, so he argues that in proportion as capitalist production is developed in a country, so in the same proportion do the national intensity and productivity of labor there rise above the international level. The different quantities of the same kind produced in different countries in the same working time they have therefore unequal international values, which are expressed in different prices, i.e., in sums of money varying according to international values. Um, yeah, it's. Oh, and then I guess I'll just finish this paragraph. It's a good observation, I suppose. The relative value of money will therefore be less in the nation with a more developed capitalist mode of production than in the nation with a less developed capitalism. It follows then that nominal wages, the equivalent of labor power expressed money, also be the higher in the first nation and the second. But this by no means proves that the same can be said of real wages, i.e., the means of subsistence placed at the disposal of the workers. So, I think what he's trying to argue here is, and I don't. There's got to be. There's again. There's a few key assumptions. So, but we'll start with the conclusion that he says. So the thing he says is that the more developed your capitalist mode of production is, um, you you have higher wages in terms of like what he says expressed in money or nominal wages, I guess. Is nominal wages, in other words, like if you're measuring in money terms, then the more developed nations have higher wages, just like numerically. However, he says it does not. That does not mean that you actually can afford more means of subsistence, right? Uh, that's the observation here is that you. So I know a good example might be like, um, I, I'm trying to think like, okay, let's take America as like the quote unquote developed capitalist country versus someone just pick one. I don't know, like a okay, sure. I mean, why not? Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know anything about Somalia's economy, but I guess the idea, I think what Marx is saying is that like if you just measure how much the average wage in America is like what 30, maybe or it's like 40K a year or something like that. 34. Is that the current one? Yeah, I thought it was closer to 40K. I don't know. It's between 30 and 40. I think though. But yeah, somewhere in there. I don't know. Someone if feel free to look up the national or the average wage in average salary or whatever annual salary in Somalia. I'm sure it's available somewhere. Okay, median. Yeah, I'm assuming median's probably higher than the average though. No, I guess so. Are we talking? Is this like just income or is this like wait? Because like I guess I'm thinking in terms of like actual salaried jobs, not like capital gains, like income. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yeah, I guess that's where it gets weird. Right. That's yeah, that must be it. Because I was like, there's not that many labor millionaires or labor billionaires. I know there's probably like a hand. I don't think there's any labor billionaires personally. I think any quote unquote worker who's worth $1 billion has to have had some licensing deal with capitalist corporation. But okay, so I'm sure. See, this is where I don't know if what Marx is suggesting here is totally true. Well, actually, okay. To be fair, he doesn't actually say that the let's say this median person in America who's got like 50 grand a year, and a median worker in Somalia who's making $1,000 a year. He's basically so. First of all, his first observation is, we'll say, is mostly correct. Where, or pretty much correct, I would say across the board, which is, yeah, if you have a more highly developed capitalist country, the numerical nominal wage there will be higher. Okay, that's fine. However, I guess what he's saying is that doesn't necessarily mean that the people in that country can afford more, or more or better means of subsistence than the other country. Um, Now, I don't think he's saying that they can afford the same means of subsistence. That might be a mistake as well. And he doesn't actually say that, right? He's just saying they're not the uh, being paid more like in dollars or numerically doesn't mean you can actually afford like a better quality of life. Um, I guess, yeah, I think there's more to it than that. Again, I think in this section, Marx is making like so many simplifications. And I think the other thing I'll mention, I don't think Marx is comparing in this example, right? I don't think in his like mind when he's writing this, I don't think he's thinking, "Oh, let me compare England to Somalia." Right? It's like at least in his time that wouldn't even make sense because I seriously doubt Somalia had any capitalist for. Yeah, that's a better. Yeah, and in fact, actually, the next page, I think he does talk about Russia versus England, which is probably the more, or yeah, he's got like also this is also kind of a funny shade. The managers are of course English, as the native Russian capitalist is incapable of handling factory business. I don't understand that shade, like why that was necessary, but kind of funny. I guess so. It's just like, damn, they can't even be good capitalists. Which, considering how much Marx shits on capitalists and how little they actually are required to do or think, it's like, oof, that is quite the shade. Well, I also don't know anything about Russian, the native Russian capitalists that he's referring to. I have no clue what he's. I'm sure he's referencing something, but or someone. Yeah, true. Or like you said, it could just be good old fashioned Slavic racism. Just Marx is he's flexing his German. He's flexing his Germanness. Yeah. It could also just literally be Orientalism. This like hasn't really changed at all. All right, last. Oh, go ahead. Oh yeah. All right, last little bit here, which is some references to state intervention, which is kind of interesting. Go over it real quick. Um. Okay, so he asks of this Mr. Carey fellow, ought not Mr. Carey to consider the fruits, sorry, consider further whether these state expenses are not the natural fruits of capitalist development. His reasoning is quite worthy of the man who first of all declared that capitalist relations of production were the eternal laws of nature and reason. His free and harmonious working was only disturbed by the intervention of the state, and then discovered afterwards that state intervention, i.e., the defense of those laws, nature and reason, by the state, alias the system of protection, was necessitated by the diabolical influence of England on the world market. Influence which, it appears, does not spring from the natural laws of capitalist. Discovered further that the theorems of Ricardo and others, in which existing social antagonisms and contradictions are formulated, are not the ideal product of the real economic movement, but on the contrary, that the real antagonisms of capitalist production in England and elsewhere are the result of the theories of Ricardo and others. Finally, he discovered that it is, in the last resort, trade, which destroys the important beauties and harmonies of the capitalist mode of production. A step further, he will perhaps discover that the one evil in capitalist production is capital itself. Only a man with such an atrocious lack of critical faculty and such spurious erudition deserved, in spite of his protectionist heresy, become the secret source of the harmonious wisdom of Bastiat, all of the other free trade optimists of the present day. Kind of a funny passage shitting on this dude, um, Carey, but interesting, like how this Carey dude, even way the fuck back then, was still like they're still harping on about that. The goofball libertarians still say this to this day, which is like, oh, capitalism would be perfect without state intervention. Um, and yeah, and then he even goes on to be like, oh, it would have been perfect without England on the like, creating the world market. And Marx is like, that's kind of part of it too. And then he says, oh, it would have been perfect without, right? And then he like, oh, it would have been perfect without all these theories from Ricardo. And he's like, Marx is like, well, those theories weren't great, but they also weren't totally wrong. And then, right, and then like he kind of jokes at the end here, basically like, or he he finally discovered that trade is actually what destroys capitalism. It's like, LOL, dude, that's kind of, it needs trade to operate. And so he's joking by saying like, if he had gone any further, he would have discovered that indeed capital is the true evil within capitalism. Basically, he's just like, he's memeing on this dude by basically being like, ironically, this dude was saying, oh my gosh, all the things that are wrong are actually all the things that make capitalism what it is. And Marx is like, you were so close. You were so close. Yeah. Yeah. Typical. At this point, I'm like expecting that pattern of Marx ending a chapter with like some dunk on somebody. Because it feels like he like gets to his point like a page or two before, like I would say like this paragraph arguably is sort of like the main point of this chapter. And then he just, let's like, I'll do a comparison here between England and Russia just to shit on Russia a little bit. And then he's like, oh, here's a table. And then he'll just be like, oh, and by the way, fuck this dude in particular. It's like, okay, end of part 6, I guess. Like, thanks, Marx. Such a, I can tell, like, this is where you can tell, like, the editing got a little lackadaisical. Because it almost feels like Marx gets into a good flow. He's developing the argument. He sort of wraps it up, and then he's just like, nah, I gotta keep going a few more pages. I got a few more things to say. Yeah. All right. Well, so I guess quick preface for next time. I think we'll do. Well, actually, this little blurb is nice as like a. I read this blurb. I won't. I think I'll go through it next time as sort of the intro, but for part 7. Um, but it's actually a really good summary of the arguments. Like not summary. What's it called? It's like Marx explaining to us like why he made the decisions he did. So he's explaining a couple like basic assumptions here, and he's also a little bit of justification on the assumptions. Yeah. So and he's also being he's saying um, for example, part of accumulation is circulation of commodities. For example, circulation of capital, and he's like, hey, I obviously that's a big part of it, but I'm just going to talk about that in volume 2. And then he also is going to say, also, by the way, I'm very well aware that capital doesn't just all get funneled back into production, right? So capitalists, or I should say, like capital doesn't just immediately get spent on making new means of production. Like we all know this is not the case, right? Capital gets spent to do all kinds of stuff. So it says, what is it? Independent forms, profit, interest, gains made through ground trade, ground rent, blah blah blah. Right? Like he's basically saying the story is more than just production. But again, we'll talk about that more in volume 3. But he's basically giving us like a nice overview here of like capital accumulation. That's sort of the theme, obviously, of this section, the process of accumulation of capital. But I'd say this section of the book, at least from like the David Harvey video and the way he lays it out, this is really like I would say the primary thesis. This is where a lot of it's going to start coming together, and we're going to start looking at the capitalist mode of production as a whole, as a entire mode of production. Like what are the large scale ramifications? Because I think so far, right, a lot of the chapters we've looked at are zooming in on different aspects. Right, so we start with like we zoom in, we start like with just the commodity form. Okay, let's look at that for a while. We'll talk about use value and exchange value, all this stuff. We just talked about wages, which is like one little component. We talked about working day. We had the behemoth of chapter 15, where it's all about technological development, how that interacts within the system. Basically, up until now, we've kind of taken bite-sized pieces of the whole, and just kind of analyze them individually. And he's also had some chapters where he does look at like how things interact But this is really, I think, the first section or the major section where he like, okay, let's put all the pieces of the puzzle back together, and then see like what does the picture look like. So yeah, I think that's we'll get to next time. Let's see. I will be. So I'll just cut the